Hi, Leonid.
Hello, Sonia. So let's get this online thing going, right? So we are not that much of the experts in getting this going. Okay, let's loosen again.
Get better.
Yeah.
That's part of the deal. We will get better. But thank you for taking the time for doing this. Um, First of all, this is our first video that we're sharing with all the families. And I wanted to start with the basics like, why are we doing this? What is your personal motivation to working on this project of anti-fragile parenting?
Well, you see, Antifragile as the book itself, right? So it came about 5 years ago, right? So, and the word antifragile actually has two meanings, right? So one is very direct and very straightforward, so which is intuitively understood. So since the greatest challenge that a parent of a child with a developmental disability experiences is actually fragility. So everything is fragile. It's a fragile situation for the child in terms of health, in terms of the emotional being, in terms of the entire sort of social situation, in terms of being surrounded by all sorts of people giving different kind of conflicting advice and so on. And at the same time, it's the situation that is fragile for the parent, because the fact is nobody has prepared you to become a parent of a child with special needs, and
So
that's really
that's
the
kind of the
challenge.
question. Like, you are well known as in the rehabilitation field, but it's interesting why you're focusing on the parents. Why do you think it's so important to work with us and help us?
Well, the fact is very simple, is that there are 24 hours in a day, right? So 168 hours a week. So, and the whole idea that 2 hours of physical therapy or 3 hours of physical therapy per week, or even anything that happens at school, with this kind of teaching and entertainment, or some a bit of stretching here and there, that they can make a big difference in the development of the child. So first and foremost, it's the home environment that actually defines the long-term outcome. And that's would be probably the summary of my experiences, in a way that realistically it's been 26 years since I've kind of first came really face to face with the rehabilitation of the child with cerebral palsy, and it's been more than 20 plus years since I've been directly involved in the rehabilitation via the parents. So this key point is that through those, say, 26 years, I consider it being able to witness something like, say, 3 generations of parenting. Because the reality is that this period between maybe 1 year old to 11-year-old, that's this kind of 10 years, that's what I call the rehabilitation generation. That's where the parent comes with the high hopes, big enthusiasm, trying to figure out things as much as they can, listen to all sorts of advice, and go through certain waves of, both enthusiasm, high hopes, then disappointments, then trying to recompose themselves and get some new enthusiasm and so on. But the reality is that by the age of maybe 11, roughly speaking, when the child really starts getting closer to the um, puberty and this growth boost, um, most of the parents, like say 90% of them, they really lose steam, and it becomes just kind of the mode of background life and survival without much of the new hopes there. So that's what I would call this rehabilitation generation. And since I've been able to witness sort of already 3 of them, there are several things in common. So even though I started in Russia in the 90s, right, so I had the opportunity and the privilege to be able to observe and work with families, from, let's say, all 5 continents and all sorts of ethnic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, ages, economic brackets,
Different
whatever.
diagnosis.
Yeah, and obviously, of course, the entire spectrum of the diagnosis, right? So from the most severe ones to the mild ones. And the reality is actually simple and quite unfortunate in a way that it turns out that people fall into the same troubles and repeat the same mistakes all over again. And if you look at the beginning of the 90s, that was well before the pre-internet era, when there was really the shortage of information, no videos, no nothing and of that kind. And the fact is that unfortunately what happens is that it's exactly the same mistakes which been repeated over and over again. And that made me think, sort of, where would my greatest observational expertise would be, right? And then what is the greatest privilege of this kind? And the greatest privilege of this kind is that I've been able actually to observe, well, roughly, I would say, probably about 6,000 families, and a lot of them through multiple years and so on. So I really accumulated quite a database, to say so, of what happens and how it works. And that came with 2 basic conclusions. And conclusion number 1 is very simple, is that it's the parenting that matters most. It's those small increments of how you taking care of the child, how you're handling the daily interactions, how you are trying to influence and modify, and at the same time how you respond to your child's behavior. What are the rewards and the incentives, what are the things you're trying to do to modify it in a direction when you have to deal with negatives and positives. So it's all these multiple things, those, let's say, several thousand micro events per day that are happening through parenting that are actually defining the long-term outcome. That's kind of the conclusion number 1. And through this conclusion number 1 comes a very simple thing, that sometimes you face the scenarios where the child is really severely affected, and you're really being surprised and amazed how much they progress thanks to their high quality parenting, right? So which is based on being in that being mindset, in being able to match the child and meet the child and then develop from there and so on. And on the other hand, the opposite happens even more often, unfortunately, right? Is that when we see kids with absolutely tremendous potential, and it's that sort of nervous, inconsistent, fragile parenting which kind of comes into sort of superposition and reinforcement of the child's fragility, and then those 2 fragilities collide, and then the whole thing just turns into a disaster. So that unfortunately happens a lot more often, and that's why I believe that this is really the essence of this whole project, is to try to share as much as possible this observations in those lessons, right? And that brings us to this point number 2. And the point number 2 is that I'm not really a parenting theorist, right? I'm not a psychologist by any means, or whatever, the social educator or any kind of that, but I'm a relatively observant person, right? And I had the opportunity to trace both the development of the children with special needs, as well as the children, as well as the siblings who come around the entire sort of family package. And these are certain traits which I've been able to just observe over and over again, which bring, if we put it that way, the quality of life and the child's progress success. And on the other hand, there are traits and parenting habits and parenting mindsets which translate into the negative outcomes, especially if we take the long-term perspective. So, and the whole idea, and the whole idea here of the anti-fragile parenting is actually to share those observations in a kind of systematic way. And, the big part why we're doing it together, right, is that for you being the voice of the parents and also having the, this background and, having so many conversations and so many feedbacks from different parents. So that really gives us the opportunity to make it into a live dialogue and, get it going.
Okay, great. I see that we have a lot of things to talk about. And, well, we should stop this conversation here and look forward for the next one.
All right, so I hope that sets more or less the tone for this, and I would apologize for having too much of a monologue part, right? So, but we'll try to keep it into a dialogue fashion as much as possible.
Don't worry, we love you as you are. Okay, thank you.